Welcome to Perspectives, the Canadian Journal of Political Economy and Social Democracy. I'm Clement Nokos, editor of Perspectives Journal and Director of Policy and Engagement at the Broadbent Institute. The 2024 Progress Summit, held in April, honored the legacy of the Institute's founder, Ed Broadbent, themed Making the Good Society, which comes from Ed's own doctoral dissertation entitled The Good Society of John Stuart Mill. To help make a good society, Ed was a major proponent of industrial strategy throughout the 1970s, to use this policy vision for social democratic change that challenged the dominance of market mechanisms, and to give the working class a chance to build economic democracy. Though that was the 1970s, we've seen a resurgence in this kind of thinking today when it comes to things like developing emerging technologies or taking serious climate action. Comprehensive policy plans in the United States, Europe, and China have taken the form of industrial strategy to guide economic transformation and development. Canada, on the other hand, seems to have lagged behind on this front, despite Ed's urging to think about industrial strategy from decades ago. To help us define how industrial strategy and policy can help Canada take serious climate action and answer why we've fallen behind, I have with me here at the 2024 Progress Summit, Hadrian Mertins-Kirkwood, senior researcher at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, where he focuses on international trade and climate change policy in Canada. Hadrian, welcome to the Progress Summit and the Perspectives Journal podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
As mentioned throughout his career, Ed Broadbent spoke about industrial strategy as a way to direct public investments and enable economic democracy throughout the 1970s and 80s, but today in the 2020s, we talk about green industrial policy. In your view, is there really such a difference, besides a choice of words, around industrial policy and strategy?
Absolutely there is. I mean, at a high level, industrial policy just kind of refers to anything a state does to shift resources into or out of a particular industry. And it's a very broad definition. That means kind of any regulation can be industrial policy, any kind of spending or subsidy, any kind of public coordination, or even direct public spending. I mean, there's so many different ways that you can do industrial policy. And by that definition, every government does industrial policy. They often don't like to admit it, but every government uses industrial policy. The big difference is that industrial strategy implies there's kind of a coherent vision. There's a plan for the future. There's a long-term orientation. There's a goal in mind. And although we see lots of industrial policy in Canada and around the world, we don't often see a lot of that clear plan, that strategy for the future, the kind of thing that Ed Broadbent would have advocated for. And especially when it comes to green industrial policy, the implication is not only are we trying to make our industry more competitive, we're also trying to reduce emissions. But again, you can do haphazard green industrial policies, but in the absence of a strategy, an overarching industrial strategy, you're going to have a hard time reorganizing the whole economy around that goal.
You know, speaking of vision, this is maybe something that the current federal Liberal government did not envision, that today in Canada, carbon taxes have become something of an issue, again, with a federal election looming. Conservatives have come clearly out against it, and Liberals are kind of contending with their own climate action legacy piece. But among the progressive left, I hear that there's a desire for more climate action policy. Of course, the federal Liberal government hasn't done enough. Yet at the same time, a desire to defend carbon taxes. How do carbon taxes then figure in wider climate policy, and what does this also have to do with industrial policy?
Carbon taxes are actually a perfect example of really good industrial policy and really poor industrial strategy. And by that I mean, ask any economist and they'll tell you that carbon pricing is the most efficient way to reduce emissions. It comes at the lowest cost to the economy as a whole. And so it is a good policy, by that metric. And I think a lot of us find ourselves having to defend carbon pricing against attacks from the right, generally disingenuous attacks about carbon pricing, just because it is, a decent climate policy. It's a fine policy. The reason it's bad strategy is, the optics, first of all, are terrible. It's not just that it's not only that, conservatives don't like it. As a consumer, you see the carbon price. We all see the price. When you fill up your car with gas or on your home heating bill, you see the price, and no one sees the benefits, because the benefits are widely distributed across the economy. And that's just a recipe for for unpopularity when you can see the cost and not the benefit. The opposite is true for something like shutting down a coal plant. We all see the benefit. The smokestacks aren't spewing smoke anymore. We can all say we've done something good for the environment. And most people don't see the costs. Of course, there are costs to the economy of shutting down a coal plant, but you don't see them. So that's just kind of the politics around carbon pricing. But I think more fundamentally, the idea of carbon pricing is that it's a market-led policy. The idea is that the government is creating conditions to incentivize the private sector to lead on emissions reductions. That's not really a strategy. It's just setting up this environment and hoping that the market solves our climate problems. And that to me is not strategic. That's very different from a publicly led industrial strategy, one that actually has a coherent vision for the future.
It's still on that maybe incoherence from the current government. Some would say that the federal government actually is doing industrial policy with major tax cuts, otherwise thought of as subsidies, for so-called clean tech sectors and other energy technologies. In your view, has this federal government been engaged seriously with industrial policy?
I think it's fair to say that yes, this federal government is increasingly taking industrial policy seriously. You mentioned the investment tax credits. We now have around $80 billion on offer from the federal government for clean industry. There's some caveats there around what counts as clean. But that's significant money, and it's one of the top spending priorities of this government. And we have things, we discussed carbon pricing already, there's all kinds of other regulations that could fall under this umbrella of green industrial policy. So, we're making moves in that direction. There's still the fundamental problem of a lack of coherent vision. On the one hand, we've committed to net zero by 2050. That implies a lot about our economy. It implies we can't be producing and consuming fossil fuels by 2050. But at the same time, the federal government is, for example, investing in and approving new oil and gas infrastructure that we know has a productive lifespan that takes it beyond 2050. The Bay du Nord offshore oil rig, for example, will be producing oil well beyond 2050. So we have a government that's committed both to climate action and to continued or in fact indefinite oil and gas extraction. And that's just an incoherent vision. So that's really the crux of the issue for me. The other piece is, and this builds on the issue around carbon pricing, is that a lot of these investment tax credits at the end of the day are about private sector leadership. And in fact, the government's been very explicit about that. They've said, we trust, we need Bay Street to lead. They know where the good investment opportunities are in the green economy. Again, to me, that's not a strategy. That's saying we're just going to make it cheaper for corporate Canada to make money in the clean economy. That's not the same as saying we have a goal we need to get to and we're going to put the full weight of government behind it. So yes, these are all policies. I still don't see the strategy.
But to me, it seems like Canada being so far behind economies like the EU, US, and China, it seems like these places, these constituencies have some sort of green industrial strategy and really go forward in enacting industrial policy. There's also now among mainstream economists a view that there's this lagging productivity in Canada. And, in these other economies as well, there are more positive productivity indicators. Does industrial policy or industrial strategy play a role in correcting this productivity gap that we're currently seeing?
Yeah, so there's two parts there. First, in terms of international examples, absolutely. I would say, Canada is not the worst in the pack on this front. We're making moves in the right direction, but compared to some of the countries you mentioned and other countries like, Denmark comes to mind, where there's a really concerted effort to lead this public interest industrial strategy, where we have workers and communities at the table, where we have states taking a leadership role, setting goals, and doing kind of everything in their power to enable transitions. China is a good example. There's a lot of qualifications around that. We don't necessarily want to emulate some of the issues around democracy, human rights, et cetera. But the Chinese solar industry is a great example of the government saying, we have all this manufacturing capacity. We see clear opportunity around the world for solar panels, and we're going to turn ourselves into a solar powerhouse. And they are now. Almost all the solar panels come from China now, or the vast majority. And that's a product of a green industrial strategy there. So you can see it working, again, with certain caveats. But yes, the U.S. with the Inflation Reduction Act saying, we are going to be the preeminent zero-emission vehicle manufacturer in the world, and putting serious money behind that. We haven't seen that coherent vision yet from Canada. Productivity is a tricky one. Economists fret about it. Productivity matters. But there's kind of, at a high level, two ways to improve the productivity of your economy. You can try and squeeze more out of workers. That tends to be the more American approach, or the more kind of small L liberal approach. And I think that's where a lot of pressure in Canada is now too. It's like, if only we can cut wages, that increases productivity. And it's true. If you're paying workers less and getting more out of them, that increases productivity. The other approach, and this is the one that's consistent with an industrial strategy, this is something we see more in places like Germany, is instead you invest in and empower workers. We train workers, we invest in research and development, we invest in public services, the kinds of things that make people more productive and make their lives better. And that is absolutely consistent with the green industrial policy, and it's something we should consider when we're developing these policies.
And so just to wrap up, clearly there is a need and a desire for vision for an industrial strategy and industrial policy. But going back to the legacy of Ed Broadbent, we see in Seeking Social Democracy, he spoke at length about how it's a bit of a tough sell, this whole idea of industrial strategy, to ordinary Canadians. How would you sell industrial policy today?
I think at any time you're trying to sell policy in name, it's going to be an uphill battle. What you have to do is show people how the policy helps them and makes them better off. And there are so many easy and good examples of that when it comes to industrial policy and industrial strategy. Public transit, for example, is a very easy one. It doesn't really matter what you call it. If people see that the transit is better in their city, if they see that we're making policy choices that enable more livable communities, all of a sudden there's more affordable housing that's transit linked and walkable communities. That's all part of an industrial strategy, and people can see their lives getting better. That's what we really have to focus on, is those on-the-ground improvements that are consistent with the long-term vision, and not worry so much, at least in our communications, with explaining why we need to do this at a policy level.
Hadrian, thank you for joining me again on the Perspectives Journal podcast.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure.
That was Hadrian Mertins-Kirkwood, Senior Researcher at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives at the 2024 Progress Summit. Join us for the 2024 Ellen Mixon's Wood Lecture featuring economist Isabella Weber at Toronto Metropolitan University on Thursday, May 30th. Earning scrutiny and then vindication for her thesis on sellers inflation, how corporations use economic shocks like the pandemic to increase price inflation and shareholder profits, Professor Weber will be delivering her insights for the first time to a Canadian context. The event, hosted by the Broadbent Institute, recognizes the legacy of scholarship and Marxist thought by historian Ellen Mixon's Wood, with a prize and lecture in her honor. Tickets for this event are now available. Please visit broadbentinstitute.ca for more information. And if you like this interview, share and subscribe to Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy, on all major podcast platforms, as well as Press Progress's Sources podcast that digs deeper into the news stories you won't find in the major papers. The Perspectives Journal podcast and Sources are proud members of the Harbinger Media Network, Canada's progressive podcast community. You can find more in Perspectives Journal, a publication of the Broadbent Institute, by visiting perspectivesjournal.ca.